Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our February Mortgage Quality and Compliance webinar. My name is Samantha Gallagher, and I am the Member Engagement Director here at the California MBA. We host these webinars on the fourth Thursday of every month. So if you are interested in becoming a member of the California MBA or participating in our Mortgage Quality and Compliance Committee, please feel free to reach out to me at samantha@cmba.com. We're really excited for the content and the presenters that we have and we're bringing you today. So with that, I want to introduce our committee chair, Michael Steer. He is the chair of our MQAC committee and also president of Mortgage Quality Management and Research. Take it away, Michael.
Thanks. Hello, and welcome to this month's MQAC webinar. My name is Mike Steer, and I'm honored to serve as MQAC chair this year, along with our vice chair, Melissa Kopel. So we have a year full of awesome webinars in store related to key industry audit, risk, compliance, and quality control topics. Now, before we get started, I'd like to share that we still have an opening for our sponsorship. So as a sponsor, you'll have all eyes on you for 30 seconds, a 30-second commercial to talk about your company on each of our webinars, in addition to having your logo, which Sam has there on there, which could be your logo, on all of our presentations and our marketing communication. So if you're interested, please reach out to Sam, Susan Malazzo, Melissa Kopel, or myself. Okay. Magsimula na tayo. Yung woman kaishi ba. Vamos a empezar. Or for most people on this call, you probably all understand, let's get started. Now, hopefully Google didn't mistranslate let's get started for me in Tagalog, Mandarin, or Spanish. But I'm sure those of you who do speak those languages will either give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Now, you might think I'm crazy speaking other languages, but this month's webinar, we start with a very relative and time-sensitive topic about limited English proficiency and the Supplemental Consumer Information Form. So I'm personally excited to welcome three very well-known compliance experts who have a deep knowledge about our topic today: Arlyn Kalinski, Raymond Snytsheuvel, and Josh Weinberg. Now, before we get started, a little bit about each one of our amazing speakers. I'll start with Raymond. So Raymond is a mortgage industry attorney with over 25 years of experience as in-house general counsel and compliance officer at the nation's leading mortgage companies. He's a partner at Garris Horn, as well as a principal at Firstline Compliance. Raymond's favorite acronyms and word associations include TILA, RESPA, ICOA, HMDA, FICRA, CCPA, Section 8, per diem interest, internal audit, risk assessment, state examinations, and many more. Take a deep breath. His goal is to provide common sense, business-minded solutions to legal and operational challenges and prove that once and for all that, no, that's not how they do it at the mortgage company down the street. Our second speaker, Josh Weinberg, he's a nationally recognized speaker, author, consultant, and leader in the mortgage industry. He's the president of Firstline Compliance, a consulting company specializing in mortgage compliance and technology, and he's a past chair of the MBA's Regulatory Compliance Committee, past vice chair of the board of directors for MISMO, as well as a member of ABA's Residential Markets Committee. Previously, he was the EVP of Compliance for Guaranteed Rate, and before that, the EVP of Compliance for First Choice Loan Services. He's also worked for a major LOS vendor where he was in charge of compliance and worked in retail banking and non-depository environments, as well as independently as the owner of a mortgage broker company. And last but not least, who Josh and Raymond have deemed the superstar of the hour, Arlyn Kalinski. So in her role, Arlyn helps deliver seamless in-language experiences that enable access to the dream of home ownership for limited English proficiency consumers and underserved communities. Arlyn is the executive sponsor and implementation owner of Guaranteed Rate's Language Access Program, LAP for short. The LAP provides an experience in Spanish from digital mortgage application, customer-facing communications, loan estimates, and closing disclosures to a centralized bilingual processing team. Now, prior to joining Guaranteed Rate, Arlyn spent 17 years working in the financial services industry with PNC Bank and Bank of America. She's held numerous leadership roles spanning multiple lines of business to include risk operations, compliance, originations, loss mitigation, foreclosure, and REO. Arlyn has been recognized by MBA Diversity Media as Top 100 Under 50. Arlyn is currently finalizing her PhD in teaching English to speakers of other languages, and her research is focused on how bilingualism and biculturalism influence cultural identity. All right, that said, let me turn it over to our amazing speakers as we jump into limited English proficiency, and the supplemental consumer information form. Take it away, Raymond.
Very good. Thank you. I appreciate that. First of all, Michael, bold and awesome way to do that. I couldn't top that. I can never be now chair and have to introduce. I'm done. That was awesome. So thank you for doing that. That was pretty neat. Thank you to the California Mortgage Bankers Association and the MQAC committee for putting me on this webinar. I truly appreciate it. In my role here, as you can see, Josh has experience in this, and of course, Arlyn, deep experience on this. I thought I would just touch really quick on the history of the foreign language issues that we have. I mean, we'll talk about it, obviously, how it goes forward, but you know, there might be a question as to why we didn't do this before, and I'll tell you why. And this dates back, well, I say 20 years, it's going to be more than that, but doing mortgage loans in foreign language was pretty tricky at the time, and that's because we, in California, have Civil Code Section 32, and which basically said back then, and it's a little bit different now, but still the same thing, any contract negotiated in Spanish must have Spanish translation. Now, when we say Spanish translation, that meant that there's got to be some underlying documents or disclosures that will translate key things. There was even confusion as to, well, the legal documents, you know, can't be in Spanish. Like, it's not. It's really a disclosure that translates the English document that was still the legal document. Next slide, please. There we go. So we knew this applied to mortgage loans because there was some specificity about what we had to translate. So it was like TILA disclosures, the note, the security instrument. So in theory, it was not, you know, a big deal if you think about it, but there's still a commitment to do these things, especially back in the day when we didn't have a lot of momentum in the community and the industry to do things in foreign language. So it was a very lonely process if you were a lender to make this commitment. Now, the real issue there is with Civil Code 1632 was if you didn't get this right, you can cancel the contract. It's basically rescission. Keep in mind, 1632 was not a mortgage provision. It was a civil code on any contract that was negotiated in Spanish. So it's you know, one of these things that if you don't do it right, I mean, it's great if you get it correct, but if you get it wrong, it could be harsh remedies. And that was the concern we had. So we see it more as, at the time, more of a punishment and not an opportunity to talk to borrowers in Spanish. And back then, Spanish was the language, the only language listed. We'll talk about it in a second. Next slide, please. So what did we have? We had challenges. So first of all, we had to translate documents. And as I said, it was a lonely process on your own. It wasn't like you had the industry or the trade groups or, you know, Fannie or Freddie pushing the initiative back in the early 2000s, in the 90s, whenever it was. We didn't have that kind of push. So translating documents was a mortgage project. And you know, that means someone's got to do it and handle it and pay for it. And so getting that commitment at the lender level was very difficult. The other thing that was bubbling up in conversations, because we did talk about this back then, was which version of Spanish would you use, right? So are we talking about, you know, Spanish from Mexico or parts of South America or the other part of South America or Puerto Rico or Spain? The Spanish is a very broad language, and so there was fear that notwithstanding our good efforts, we would have picked the wrong one that wasn't good enough. So that was part of the issue. There's a chilling effect, if you will, to push that initiative. The other thing that had come up was, well, if you negotiate in Spanish in the originations, doesn't that mean we have to service the loan in Spanish? And that was a concern, and it was a valid legal concern that we didn't know what the answer was. So what really happened was investors or downstream partners didn't want to get involved in a loan that was tagged for Spanish, you know, that was negotiated in Spanish, for the fear that maybe there was a requirement and they were worried about that. Remember, there wasn't a lot of guidance on this. This is what we had to live with. Next slide, please. Now, we did have, actually, the back. California was pretty much the state with this kind of teeth. In other words, having this otherwise cancel the underlying contract issue. Other states had some laws, maybe like Texas with advertising, and New Jersey did, but it really was just California. It wasn't prevalent in many, many states. It was mostly California. But that makes sense as far as making a policy, because most lenders will do a lot of loans in California. So that kind of drove the policy to do it or not. So what ended up happening was, because of the remedy was this could be canceled, or there's going to be someone can challenge the underlying note or security instrument, the perception of the risk of doing Spanish transactions was very real. And so in legal and compliance, the things we had to do was advise, okay, go ahead and get it right. Let's get translated documents. Let's train everybody, so on and so forth. Or don't negotiate in Spanish. The borrower has to get their own translator, qualified translator, and even that was up to in the air as to, could it be their minor child that's doing the translation? Does it have to be an adult? Does it have to be a certified translator? Remember that the teeth on the law, at least the way it was written, was it was very real. The risk was very real. This wasn't for a lack of wanting to do it. In fact, I submit, I know lenders wanted to do that. I know they did it because I could hear it on the phone, on the origination. They would speak Spanish with the borrowers. And as much as I appreciate that, I was worried about the risk side of doing that, even there are policies not to do that. So that was the world that we were in, and we didn't have a lot of support. It was an individual thing, and the communities and the industry wasn't pushing for more. So that's where we kind of were in the time. Next slide, please. Now, we didn't really see much legal action despite the rule. I do believe there was a major lender back in probably the early 2000s that in a settlement on the consumer protection, they kind of committed to doing it, and they did do it, and I think they probably did it right. I have no reason to believe they didn't. There were cases that bubbled up during the meltdown with mixed results, but at the end of the day, Spanish negotiation meant high risk. That was just the way we had to process it from a legal compliance perspective. When you're in-house head of company, you had to explain that, particularly on California laws. You could do things other states, but really you couldn't split up what's at the end of the day. It's like, don't do it. We were really concerned. As much as we wanted to do it, don't do it if you're not going to do it right. Next slide. Now, we do know that the Civil Code eventually was modified to add, I think, 4 more languages, give us some more details, but the risk remained the same. It was still the issue of if you don't get it right, there could be real harm to your contract. You know, what we are now seeing with community involvement, our demographics changing, opportunity to recognize diversity, so many other things. And now, again, we're talking the industry is kind of pulling it together as well, that it's now almost a fair lending risk if you don't do things in a foreign language or offer it in some cases, or at least figure out what's significant to the consumer. Are they aware? Maybe we have someone on the phone, maybe not, but it was really now part of a dialogue that we didn't have before. And in fact, I would say, and I bet Arlyn and Josh can tell you, now it's more seen as a lending opportunity, possibly, that we couldn't see. We always wanted it, but it wasn't clear what to do. And I think also downstream lending partners are more accepting of this now. I want to say that at some point we realized if it's negotiated in Spanish, and using the old rule, if it's negotiated in Spanish, you don't have to service in Spanish. So there were some kind of evolutions to that effect. But again, you talk back in the day, we would love to have done more of this in the past. We just couldn't. So there were challenges. So that's pretty much it for me. I'm going to hand it off to Josh, and they'll explain more now how we see the future, and which is what, a few weeks, and take it from there. But anyway, Josh.
Thanks very much, Ray. And that's actually a great segue. There's a lot of compliance risks, and we'll talk through some of those. Ray has raised some of those as well. The way I look at things is there's compliance because you have to, and there's compliance because you should. And in my perspective, the compliance because you should is going to carry the day because of shifts in the socio and makeup of our country and the changes to the demographics that we're seeing. These couple of slides, and I should say there's a lot of information on these slides. I'm not going to read them or go through all of it, but I wanted you to have the data to take back. And you'll notice that these are sourced so that they can be used for researching or providing some of the self-assessment that lenders do as part of their process to roll out language accommodation. What I'm going to cover here and in the next couple of slides succinctly is this is looking at the 2018 to 2028 timeframe in terms of household formation. We're going to see next in the 2028 to 2038 timeframe, and then we're going to look at population growth. To summarize these next 3 slides, and we can click through to the next for now, as we stand, household formation and population growth of white non-Latino households has actually turned negative. And the growth of all household formation and population are from households and communities of color. Latinos are leading the pack with about 63–64% of the entire population, followed by Chinese, which is about 13%. The only groups growing faster than Latinos are multicultural households. Next slide, please. So what that means is our market has shifted. Who we're seeing as customers, the folks we're going to be serving don't look like or sound like the communities that we have been serving. There's been a lot of talk about the origination market and how 2023 is going to be devastating. I actually take a different approach. When we look at projections and statistics from groups like the MBA, we see that 2021 had over 4 trillion origination volume. That was the unicorn. 2022, just over 2 trillion, and 2023 estimated to be about 1.6 to 1.8 trillion. If we look back over about the 14 years before that, there really were only 4 years where volume was over $2 trillion. So while comparing peak to trough shows some areas of concern, 2023 really is the potential for a good origination year historically. As I mentioned though, the borrowers that are looking for the loans are not the low-hanging fruit. It's time for lenders to climb the trees and find the borrowers who want those loans, and our methodologies or opportunities for outreach need to reflect those different makeups of those borrowers. Next slide, please. I wanted to highlight here, as Ray mentioned, a lot of loans are getting done in California. So much so that 31% of all loans originated in the country are in just 4 states: California, New York, Florida, and Texas. That's important because almost all of the top 10 lenders have a foothold in at least one and likely more of these markets. And as lenders are looking for opportunities to originate, we need to be aware of what that makeup is and where those borrowers are coming from. Next slide, please. This is another way of looking at it. And just a month or two ago, Rob Chrisman highlighted it could be as much as 20 to 25% of the nationwide production coming from California alone. That's also important because 28% of the LEP population in the country lives in California, while California, Texas, New York, and Florida make up about 61% of the Hispanic population, but only a third of the total population. The reason I'm highlighting this is we've got a heavy concentration into states for where we're serving borrowers. Next slide, please. So as we're looking at the Latino and Hispanic culture, it's important to understand the cohort or how these borrowers are made up. Median age right now is 29 and a half. Really important because the typical home buying age in the young 30s for Hispanics, usually 34 across the board, most Hispanics are below that 34-year-old age. Again, that becomes important because not only do these households, are they younger, they've grown up on YouTube, on Siri, on mobile devices. The way we reach them and the way they learn and interact with information is fundamentally different. While peak home ownership rates for Hispanics is typically between 66 and 70, I argue that data point is somewhat stale and is going to shift as the population increases. Next slide, please. Another key fact to look at is that particularly in Latino households, but also in other multicultural groups, we commonly see multi-generational households. Of the group of Latinos that are in this average or median 29-year-old range, the majority of them are actually born in the US, which means they're native English speaking, but bilingual. And really important that if they're living in multicultural households or multi-generational households with grandparents or aunts and uncles that may not speak English, the methodologies of reaching consumers are the same as they've been. Trust sells. How do we provide an experience to consumers and to borrowers that not only they understand, but the people who are going to be involved in those important financial decisions who may not be the borrower also understand? And so when we're looking at how do we serve these communities and groups, we need to be aware of not just that borrower, but what is their household like and who are the people involved in that decision. Next slide, please. I've used this phrase a lot, and I don't mean it to be tongue-in-cheek or insulting, but I believe it's true. Over the past decade, industry has spent hundreds of billions of dollars trying to improve the borrower experience. When a borrower says they prefer to speak Spanish, and our response as a lender is, oh, that's nice, but we're only going to speak English, that's not $1 billion experience. It's time for industry to do better. We can do better. Next slide, please. I used to say to stay in business in 5 years, to be in business in 5 years, we've got to meet borrower expectations. Now I actually think this is a game changer. Lenders who are going to take market share, and I've used this analogy before, if the origination pie is shrinking, what are lenders doing to take a bigger piece of the pie? Borrowers make it clear, if you want my business, speak my language. That's the reason in ATMs we see multiple language, sometimes 14, 20 languages offered in an ATM. We see Amazon provide over 100 different languages for shopping. it's time for industry, and unfortunately, I think the mortgage industry tends to lag behind. I've often said that the mortgage industry doesn't change unless we have to. My argument is because of the shifting demographics, we have to. Some of the guidance that's been issued makes it clear that doing something is better than nothing. And my very sophisticated risk weighting or risk analysis perspective is the juice worth the squeeze? I'm telling you now, in this environment, the juice of providing language accommodation is very much worth the risk that may be associated with providing it. Next slide, please. So what have the Fed said? We talked some about California and 1632 and the amendments to 1632.5. We have states like Massachusetts that also require translated disclosures. There are a myriad of states that have unconscionability statutes, which are like UDAP statutes that likely are involved. But we've actually seen information from the Fed side as well. Going back to 2016, we had the Office of General Counsel provide guidance that language preference is a proxy or a connection to national origin, and the line between national origin and race is very thin. So what they've largely said is, to the extent that we as lenders have resources to provide to someone that has a language preference that's not English, and we don't make them available, that is likely discrimination based on national origin or race. In January of 21, the guidance that's gotten a lot of information under Director Kraninger provided recommendations around serving consumers with limited English proficiency. At the core was providing a compliance management system that included LEP or an LEP specific CMS program. Later in 21, we had the CFPB, as they did a report of the largest servicers in the country to monitor their response to the pandemic, saw more than half of the major servicers not even asking the question of whether the borrowers have a language preference. Even later in 21, we saw the CFPB send RFIs and request additional information, not under an examination or enforcement context, but looking for information, particularly to call centers, on whether lenders were asking the language preference question, and again, in call centers that spoke Spanish, how they were accommodating Spanish-speaking borrowers, and in call centers that did not provide language accommodation, what types of services they were providing, and if they were prepared to do so in the near future. Next slide, please. I think we've had a couple of game changers. One is, as we know, in May of last year, the FHFA directed Fannie and Freddie to require the language preference question through the Supplemental Consumer Information Form, so the SCIF. As we know, the SCIF is required starting March. That means for every loan that's going to be sold to the GSEs, lenders are obligated to send a document to the borrower asking about their language preference. In June of last year, HR 3009 passed. HR 3009 was a 100-day bill. It was looked at as a telegraph bill, the Congress telegraphing their intention that language preference and language accommodation be important. This passed through the Racial and Equity Inclusion Package again on June 15th. It's so far considered there is unlikely to be a companion bill in the Senate, but had it passed, or will it pass in the Senate, it will require all federal mortgage disclosures to be translated in up to 8 languages. It would have additional requirements like the SCIF requesting language preference and looking for additional forms of language accommodation like oral translations. In August, FHFA followed up and said, well, we're not done with just the SCIF. We have this requirement in servicing to transfer fair lending or fair servicing data, which includes specifically preferred language or language preference. If we go back a little bit to 2020 and the CFPB's RESPA reform around servicing, there was an intentional broadening of the definition of a loan servicing file, essentially to include any information or documentation that the servicer has about that borrower, and then requiring policies and procedures for the company that's going to transfer servicing to provide it to the new servicer, and for the company that's going to obtain the servicing to have policies and procedures to make sure they got all of that information. Suffice it to say, I think it's pretty clear now, language preference is a data point that must be included in the loan servicing file. Next slide, please. Let me put this together from another capacity. With the language preference from the SCIF, The HMDA information related to the what we call disaggregated fields, where the consumer can self-identify, not just are you Latino or not Latino, but do you have a sub-preference of Mexican or Puerto Rican, or the additional ones you can see. So I throw out this example. Ernesto Gonzalez is applying for a loan in the San Joaquin Valley. For those not from California on the call, the San Joaquin Valley is one of the highest one of the communities with the highest concentration of Latino people. Speaking with an originator, Lupe Hidalgo, who indicates on the website or business cards, hablo español, and Mr. Gonzalez identifies that Spanish is his preferred language preference and self-identifies as being Mexican. We're now left with a pretty wholesome set of data based on geography, ethnicity, and language preference that probably indicates Spanish was spoken. So will lenders be able to prove that we provided the disclosures under 1632 and 1632.5, or provided additional language accommodation to avoid the other states' unconscionability and UDAP risks? If we can't prove that Spanish was not spoken, we're going to need to prove that we provided or met those requirements. Next slide, please. I've been beating this drum for a while, back to that compliance because we should. As the majority of the market is speaking Spanish, it is a business imperative to serve our markets. But I'm not alone now. In November, we had a group of consumer advocates send a letter to FHA recommending key requirements to advance language accommodation. One was requiring a language preference question like FHFA for HUD and FHA. The other was to require translated disclosures. The other was to provide verbal translations as accommodation, and to require an update for a language access plan or a mandate for a language access plan, which we'll talk about in a moment, and for FHA to track their counterparties for who is providing this type of accommodation and who is not. Next slide, please. So Arlyn will talk some about this as well. Where I typically recommend lenders focus is in a language access plan. To be clear, a language access plan was created primarily by Department of Justice and HUD. It is not so far required for the mortgage industry, but it does lay out a path or a blueprint to follow. What I usually say is, if we have no plan, we are subjecting ourselves to open criticism. Someone coming in from the outside will throw whatever at the wall to see what sticks, without any ability for us as a lender to say, well, this is why that may not apply. The language access plan sets the four corners for us to be criticized. It starts with a self-assessment, identifying the consumers that we serve, what languages they speak, and the points of contact or resources necessary to serve them. We've got to have a policy, a written policy that we can refer back to that documents what types of accommodation we will have, the types of training we'll provide, and that will do ongoing review. We have to look at how we're making people aware of the accommodation that we have. Things like I speak cards are common in the medical capacity, but lobby signs or indications on our websites beyond just hablo español, but these are the types of accommodation that we can provide. Training is critical. If we've taken these steps, we need to make sure our team knows about it, both about the resources available and who and how to serve consumers that express a need for language accommodation. And then, of course, we need to be able to monitor, evaluate, and update our plan so that it stays consistent with our policies, but also looks to serve the additional elements that we've identified in our self-assessment. Next slide, please. Arlyn, let me turn it over to you, please.
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys today. I will get right into it. Next slide. So the SCIF is upon us. When the changes were shared by the FHFA, it was our time to take a step back, take a hard look at our organizations and all of the data, that Josh just went over, that we see in the census shared by the Urban Institute and others, and completing that self-assessment and making a determination on what your approach or strategy is going to be. Meaning, Are we going to just comply with what is being required of us? Or are we going to build what is needed, what should be done? What is your enterprise-wide language services strategy? Do you have one? If not, now is the time to document one. If the approach is doing what is required, there are a few practical, logistical things to keep in mind, starting with the fact that we are all being impacted by limited resources, IT resources, both internally and at the LOSs. So in the event your organization has not yet taken the steps needed to comply with the March 1st changes, realistically sending business requirements to IT developing those changes, completing QA, UAT testing before moving to production in 4 business days is almost impossible. Updates will be needed to databases to map accurately into the LOS fields. Changes to initial and final closing packages to include the SCIF are needed, which again requires development, QA, UAT. For example, is the SCIF printing correctly for borrower and co-borrower? Is the stacking order of the packages printing correctly as expected? And obviously, potential changes that could be needed to your servicer or your servicing systems to reflect that language preference. Those are just some pretty high-level items to consider. And that is if you're doing just what's required. Now, if your strategy or the strategy for your organization is to implement a forward-focused, forward-thinking language strategy to address, as Ray mentioned, the opportunity, because you really need to. Again, looking at the demographic data right in front of us and the focus of the first-time home buyers right now, then the approach is why stop at the GSEs? Ask the question on the FHA loans, jumbo, non-QM products. Set alerts and ribbon messages in LOSs for employees to clearly be able to identify the consumer language preference. Ensure you're mapping language preference from your digital applications into the LOS and other internal systems, meaning not just through a manual application, capture language preference. And if HUD joins the GSEs on this effort, you certainly do not want to have to go back to your IT teams and ask them to do the work all over again for different loan programs. I have said this before, those that don't act or are unprepared for the impacts of these upcoming changes will probably lose market share. Those that act early will lead. So from my standpoint, when I look at the consumer impact, the SCIF enhancement is a step in the right direction. The intent is to make the home buying experience for borrowers with limited English proficiency more inclusive. We know that one of the barriers to homeownership is the lack of language access. So work to stand up a comprehensive language access program. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I outline pretty high-level items for consideration. How do you build a language access program? What things should you keep in mind? First of all, make the business case. Make the business case to your leadership with data and projections. You certainly need buy-in from the whole organization because this touches all business units, from HR and operations to technology, training, communication teams. Everybody needs to be engaged and have objectives within the project. Understand the CFPB recommendations. So looking at those recommendations, reviewing and following the roadmap set by the CFPB, and they were clear on the roadmap. You don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to do 10 languages all at once. Document your rationale, document your journey. the CFPB will accept your journey as a valid justification if you have the data and the documentation behind it, why you did what you did. So those are things to consider. Also, completing a 50-state assessment that outlines your requirements and really looks at what you need to present to the consumer in a foreign language to comply with the state law based on the type of business that you have. Identifying stakeholders is another critical item. Those stakeholders within the organization that will co-own the project with you, as well as our legal, risk, and compliance partners. It will obviously take performers with grit and determination to help drive a program like this, and getting their buy-in is very important. Obviously, outlining the inherent risks and documenting the required controls as you go, as you're building, as you're having these conversations with all the different teams. Be at the table, understand what the inherent risks are, and document those controls per risk identified. Set thresholds ahead of time for what you're trying to build and what controls you want to build, what type of controls. Setting that threshold for automated controls versus manual controls, and then what the monitoring will look like after the fact, after you go live. Templatize and automate. Use the templates and automate as much as you can to reduce risk. Collaborate with subject matter experts or external vendors that can amplify your program, that can help eliminate some of the state law risks associated with a language access program. Thinking about translation and interpretation services, language certification programs to confirm the proficiency of those employees that are communicating with consumers in a foreign language. Having digital financial education content, including displaying loan terms, disclosures in foreign languages, using those templates that are already translated, already available to us through the clearinghouse and others. And Josh spoke about this, having the overarching language policy and all the procedures that go hand in hand with that policy. And then constant training and communication with the staff on how to stay compliant within the language access program. That is another critical thing. And obviously go big, right? Be a trailblazer. Think about what can I do, looking at your organization, and then building your program to be able to help consumers or LEP consumers. And Josh mentioned this as well, and I also believe it. We can't run away from risk. We have to analyze the risk and stand up the appropriate controls that eliminate or minimize the risk. As organizations and as compliance practitioners, we should be able to accomplish that, to expand language access in the mortgage industry, that way bringing more communities into the dream of homeownership. It is certainly not easy to stand up a language access program. There's a lot of work that goes into it, and there's always optimization that needs to happen throughout. After you go live with the program, you still have to optimize it and find opportunities to make it better. But big change doesn't happen overnight either. So it's taking that into consideration, that it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And keeping that in mind will allow you to be able to create a language access program that is continually growing. It never ends.
Arlyn, if I can, just to toss a couple questions over to you, because it was one of the reasons I was so excited that you'd be on this presentation. You represent It's Possible. We talk a lot about in theory, oh, we had this language access plan and we can provide language accommodation. You've been able to implement this in your past in a guaranteed rate. How's it gone for you? Has it been successful?
It's been very successful. I mean, we get positive feedback on a daily basis from loan officers, from new hires, from our operations staff, that and our consumers as well, right? That they love the fact that they are able to, the consumers specifically, navigate through the whole process on their own, and they feel that they clearly understand what they're signing, and they feel empowered that they have all of this information right in front of them that, you know, before they didn't. And our loan officers love it too, right? Because they can actually, there was before, and you guys know this, there's a lot of, let me call them because I need to explain things. And a lot now is they can self-serve, and the loan officers can spend time growing their business and discussing with the consumers those critical transaction conversations. But just being an interpreter, they don't have to do that anymore, right? The consumer can self-serve through all of the different customer-facing communications that we offer to them in their preferred language.
I think that's huge. And I've usually said, and kind of give compliance guidance, lenders usually don't look good in the headlines, but this is something I feel good we can shout from the mountaintops. I proudly serve Spanish-speaking borrowers. I proudly serve people that don't speak English. Oh, and by the way, loan originators, come here to originate to your community and do it in a wholesome way, in a responsible and in a sustainable way.
Yep, agree.
And if anybody has any other questions, just type it in the chat, and we're happy to answer those for you. I've got a question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
So I've got a question for the group. You see a lot of mortgage companies that recruit on the front end, strong multilingual or bilingual origination talent, so loan officers and processors, but maybe they don't have strong multilingual or bilingual resources on the back end, which would be like your risk, your QC, or your compliance, to be able to kind of audit like what's going on those phone calls or call recordings or the QC of the documentation. What would be your advice to those companies that maybe are stronger on the front end on loan officers and processors that are multilingual, but you have the compliance aspect of oversight and testing, and you might not have resources that can translate what's the language being spoken?
I can take it first and then pass it on to Ray and Josh. I'll say that they do need to become stronger in the back end. So the demographics of the country, their companies should reflect, or the goal should be that their company across the board, the companies reflect the demographics of the country. So if we're talking about 20% Latino in the US, for example, the company should reflect that across the board, and they should have support, not just from a risk and like legal and compliance business units, but also when we talk about mortgage, let's talk about underwriting, right? That is one critical role that also needs to have that representation, diverse representation as well, right? There are certain nuances with certain cultures and certain loan programs. So understanding those nuances is critical for loans to be able to go through the process in a clean and accurate way as well.
Yeah, I'd chime in. I think Arlyn really hit on some of the key points as well, and it starts with the standing up of the program. Have we set those automated versus manual controls? Do we have a monitoring and review process to see if the program is working as we expected it to? And while I think it's really important to maintain people that look like our customers, that we've got the cultural sensitivity and representation, I also think it's important, and this doesn't necessarily need someone who's fluent or bilingual, to look at the structure of the controls and monitor whether the process has been followed. Those types of compliance testing and process monitoring and testing, those I think are ways that even without a bilingual staff, we can see if we're following our policy, if our plan is being implemented in the way that we designed it.
Yeah, and let me add to that too, because Michael, you bring up a good example. Like you monitor calls, and so and a lot of people do that. It's a good control. How do you monitor calls that are in a foreign language if you're not prepared to do that? And I think the answer is, I think Arlyn hit it right. You should get to that point. In the meantime, and I'm talking to many of my clients who have limited resources. Yeah, you probably should soon enough start monitoring calls, say in Spanish. And if you don't have someone in compliance, find somebody in the meantime that can help you with that and pull it in. So we're not saying you have to get a compliance professional who speaks Spanish. Find somebody in QC or the department, or even get another resource, outside resource, to at least monitor a couple calls. Who knows, depending on percentage, right, of the call. So I do think you have to think about it. I'm not saying we have to scramble and start hiring staffing today just to get monitoring on phone calls, but get creative with solutions. But I don't think you're going to be excused from it going forward, certainly in the long run.
I've actually gotten a couple of questions just from the crowd, from phone or otherwise. So if it's okay, I'll launch one of them.
Yeah, go ahead, Josh. Yeah.
And one was, how do we see lenders asking a language preference question and collecting the SCIF data? Will we expect to see that in point of sale systems? Will it be exclusively a disclosure? Will we ask it on phone calls or using scripts? I don't feel like I should ask the question and answer it. So maybe I'll kick it to Arlyn and Ray to go for it.
I would say all of the above as much as possible, right? So, as for example, if you're looking at a loan officer, you're directing potentially your client, your consumer to your digital application link, for example. And as I mentioned during one of my slides, is having that question within your digital application where the consumer, as they are self-serving, going through the application, the digital application on their own, they can get to that question and answer the question. But the same thing on your loan origination system, you should be able to enable that question in that system so that if your loan officer is taking the application from the consumer over the phone, they should be able to also get to that question and have the consumer provide a response and ask the question over the phone and answer it manually on their LOS.
I'll just kind of piggyback a little bit. And this really gets to one of the points you made as well, Arlyn. Don't stop with just the GSE loans, particularly to the extent we're having that first communication with the borrower. That's probably the best point from a borrower experience perspective to ask what their language preference is. And that early in the process, we may not know what loan type or product they're going for. So even if not selling to the agencies, even if not required to, having that information helps to set the right resources or response so that borrower is provided the appropriate type of service and gives them an experience that will want them to not only feel satisfied with their transaction, but refer others to you. Michael, Samantha, we've got other questions?
Yeah.
We have. So we've actually had one guest, he put a comment in, and it was Latino demographic leads all demographics in adoption of new technology, which I thought was very interesting. We also have a question that came in, is what is your estimation of the ROI of in-language experiences? For example, percentage of application increase, added loan value closed, etc. The right thing to do still needs its business case. No.
I can speak anecdotally, and Arlyn, to the extent you're able to, I'd love to if you share it as well. As many of you know, I work with Documents. Documents is a technology that provides translated disclosures and language accommodation resources and tools. And what we are seeing from lenders that provide Documents for Spanish speakers, the lender with the highest usage is seeing about an 84% usage rate, others at about 74%. So just the fact of accessing the technology to me is validation. People want it. That's with no incentive or no coaching to do so, but it's people wanting to know about their transaction and to know about the key concepts about their loan in native language.
I'll add to that, just that, kind of reinforce that line that I stated at the end of my presentation. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So when we talk about ROI, specifically linked to language access, it's going to take time, a little bit of time, for you guys, for lenders to be able to see. It's not just going to happen magically, right? Because you have to get the word out. You have to show like marketing, the value of the program. And it's not something, like I said, that happens overnight. So whenever the business case is made to stand up the language access program in your organization, that needs to be pretty clear with the leadership teams and all the teams that will be working that on the project, that it's not going to happen overnight, that it's going to take a little bit of time for you to see that lift, like the applications coming in, and the increase of applications triggering RESPA, etc.
Let me add to that too, if I could, based on my experience, all these years that I've had to tell sales, you can't do things in Spanish, for example. They did it anyway. It was something that they really wanted. And now the ROI issue is more in technology and investment, et cetera. And it goes back to, if you want to do it right, then you got to do these things. And Arlene, Josh, you're correct. You get the levers in place, and so it's worth it. But I think a lot of the drive will come from the sales anyway, because they did it. This is what they wanted to do. And if anything, we had to pull them back. So I think, unlike other compliance, the business cases we had to make, the energy is already there if you phrase it correctly. But that's just my thoughts and my experience. And so I'm not saying, of course, it's there. It's not. You do have to talk it through and put a business case. But ironically, one of maybe your best allies might be the people on the front line who are in sales and say, yeah, we want this.
Let me answer one other question, because compliance is not often looked at as the group that's generating revenue, but I do think we often save it. Based on the demographics and based on the requirements, and let's just say California alone, DFPI has been slow and has not been frequent to take enforcement action for violations of 1632 or 1632.5. Similarly, we haven't seen many federal actions against the fair lending violations or potential language preference or connection to national origin cases. I would caution that the tides are changing. I often look at the role of regulators to supervise and oversee the majority of the market. When the majority of the market is speaking Spanish, expect there to be additional oversight and regulation of how lenders are providing Spanish services. So even if it's not an area where we're immediately bringing in additional transactions or increasing our recruiting, it is going to be something that's worth a while, because when that call comes, how do you provide the service? Or when there's a challenge that the borrower was spoken to in Spanish and negotiated in Spanish, but only received English documents, one loan being voided is going to be way more expensive than the cost of an implementation program.
And I think eventually consumers will expect this, right? We're just on the forefront of it, just like, Amazon, you can buy at one click of the button. You expect speed of service and information at your fingertips, that if you're not implementing a language access program to go after some of the demographics that are changing in the United States, then you're really decreasing your piece of the pie to be able to go out and capture that. Because I know, Arlene's going to be out there leading the charge, trying to capture those demographics.
We will.
We had one
sure.
more. I think we have. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that, as an industry, we should be able to find the solutions to support these consumers and meet them where they are. And we want to help them, as I mentioned, feel empowered, that they understand what they're signing. And, Josh mentioned this as well, but, trust is critical in our industry. And we need to be able to find ways to help people find confidence in the process. And if they have a great experience with a lender, they're going to come back and spread the word, right? And when we build programs like these, we all win. So that's why I'm here today, obviously, because I feel that this is just bigger than than us, and it's a change for the industry for the better.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Do you anticipate the CFPB or other regulators to publish acceptable translations for all major languages?
I'll jump first on that. So I highly recommend everyone look at the FHFA Language Clearinghouse. On that page, there are translated versions of the loan estimate and closing disclosure in English, Spanish, and they leverage some of the resources from California, which provide translated disclosures in Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, Tagalog. Those resources exist. FHFA and CFPB work together on the Language Clearinghouse, as well as on the financial terms translations glossary. And I do anticipate, again, HR 3009 would have required a minimum of 8 languages within 6 months and an additional 4 within 6 months after the bill's passage. So those 5 languages, Spanish, Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, Tagalog, FHFA and other research has shown that will cover about 85% of the LEP population in the country. Yes, I do anticipate there being other languages. I think to Michael's point, not just because the federal government may require them, but because borrowers are going to require them in order to serve the purpose. As I mentioned in the letter and had in the slide, the letter that was sent by the consumer groups to FHA also pushed for translated disclosures and implementation of a language access plan. I would not be surprised to see FHA, particularly given their role and their strong prominence in serving first-time home buyer and diverse communities, as looking at translated documents or disclosures or other language accommodation as a key way of meeting those requirements.
I think you'll see more vendors enter the space as well to be able to offer similar services. Documents is already out there. All right, Sam, are we good?
I think we're good.
All right, so I want to thank all of our speakers. It was such an informative presentation. You could hear the passion behind everybody's voice and the purpose of what we're trying to do on these webinars. I just want to let everybody know we've got upcoming topics, HMDA, cybersecurity, QC, compliance, and more this year. So be on the lookout for our marketing that comes out the 4th Thursday. Every month, we'll have our webinars for the MQAC committee, and just want to say thank you, Arlyn, Raymond, Josh, awesome job. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks to my co-panelists. Thanks to California MBA for leading the charge here. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you guys. Have a good one. Thanks everyone who joined.
Thank you.